Welcome to the Sports Pharmacy Network show where we dispense clinical and evidence-based information to optimize health and human performance. I'm Brandon Welch, clinical pharmacist, and your host for today's show. My girl Kaylee, our usual podcast host, is enjoying the Memorial weekend. So while I'm here holding down the fort recording today's episode, today's guest really needs very little introduction in the world of sports performance and human optimization. He's someone who is incredibly well respected in this space, and I'm excited to welcome Pratik Patel to the show. Pratik is a sports performance consultant, educator, entrepreneur, and founder of Blueprint Performance Health. With more than 15 years of experience working across elite sport and human performance, he has become one of the leading voices in blood biomarkers for human performance, diagnostics, peak recovery, nutrition, and real-world health optimization. His background includes 4 NFL seasons with the New York Giants, 7+ years across power conference college programs. He's also contributed to conference championship teams, national championship appearances, and has worked with everyone from elite athletes and coaches to executives, military personnel, and high-stress professionals. Through Blueprint Performance Health, Pratik now focuses on helping athletes, coaches, clinicians, and performance professionals better understand the intersection of biomarkers, diagnostics, nutrition, recovery, and long-term health optimization, while translating complex science into practical, real-world application. Today, we're going to dive deep into blood-based biomarkers for peak health and performance, along with some of the biggest misconceptions we see in sports performance today, especially when it comes to understanding and properly contextualizing lab values. My guy, Teek, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, man, especially on Memorial Day.
It's all right. The kids are at the pool with the grandparents, so we're kind of getting things squared away at the house, cleaning and whatnot.
Awesome, man. Well, we're going to unpack a really good episode for our audience here. So we're going to dive right into it. For those in the audience who may not be familiar with your background, can you share a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so we'll make it quick. My undergrad was in dietetics, really enjoyed everything about nutrition and how important it can be. And then I got a master's in kinesiology, so really combining nutrition and exercise, which, we could say is a really big fundamental core piece for everybody throughout their lifespan. It's not just for athletes, it's not just for young people, it's for everybody. And was very fortunate enough and lucky to have had opportunities to kind of progress in a career doing what I loved, nutrition, recovery, exercise, a few different colleges, K-State, Michigan State, Oregon. And then, on the coaching staff with the Giants, running the nutrition program, biomarkers, supplementation, but also as an assistant strength coach. So you learn a lot when you get exposed to not only high-level elite people, but people that are in the space with different backgrounds and subject matter expertise. So athletic trainers, physicians, strength and conditioning coaches, sports scientists, sports performance professionals, dietitians, and then really understanding and looking at the system of the human body as a whole. And it's not just one area, which is really, really important, but all of it really much interconnects and is very much intertwined. So we know that when we're working with really, really high level personnel, and, the whole term high performer gets thrown around quite a bit. These days, everybody's a high performance coach, but if you have to have a way to actually define it and diagnose it. So I would say, high level athletes that are successful and have very extended careers are very much intertwined in high performance. And our goal was to learn as much as we can about them and keep them as healthy as possible, knowing that, look, if you want to sustain high performance, doing the things that they do on a day in and day out basis is a very massive stressor to the body. Playing a 16, 17 game NFL season, playing multiple sports in college, doing it day in and day out is going to stress the body. And we know that if you want to achieve great things, you have to do that. So yes, performance is at the forefront of that, but not at the expense of health, because we know that everybody has different background, different predispositions, different habits. They adapt to stressors in a variety of different ways. And unless you know how to define it, address it, and attack it, some of these athletes, and we know the athlete injury rate from youth athletes all the way to the pros is skyrocketing. And we are in this midst of everybody putting more money and emphasis on technology, monitoring, strength and conditioning, nutrition and supplementation and wearables, but what is actually making a positive contribution? So, going back to what makes up basic physiology. You got predisposition, somebody's current health status, how they adapt to it, and what can you actually do with it. You know, getting blood biomarkers done. And this started almost a decade ago when I really got myself immersed into it. So I was very green when I started. I was not. I will say that. So if anybody is really interested in learning more or trying it, you don't have to be an expert right out of the gate. You just have to understand, what am I looking at and how can I make sense of it?
Yeah. I mean, you hit a lot of great points. And one of the things that I always like to preach too, which is where we kind of speak the same language, is how do you intersect health with performance, right? So you can't put performance ahead of health, is because if you're unhealthy, how long is your career really going to last if we're only focused on performance? And so there needs to be some harmony. And one of the things I really love about your approach to athletes and then some of the other folks that you consult with is how do we look not just outside of the body, which are more of the obvious things, but also how do we look underneath the hood, which is more of those blood based biomarkers that can really help give us a full picture on the direction of someone's health and how that can lead to lead to the longevity of an athlete's career or even a high performer in general.
Yeah, because I think that's really, really important. Everybody falls in love with these external metrics. You know, if you've been working in sport performance, everybody likes talking about how strong is the guy, you know, how fast is he, how powerful are they? You know, everybody falls in love with training videos and the NFL Combine, and you know, what are they posting in the off season that they're doing, and how fast did this person run? But we already know, you know, if you get to that level, whether it's high level college, even high school, or professional sport, elite sport, you have physical qualities that allow you to sustain those workloads. You know, you have a certain base level of strength and power and endurance and, you know, stamina. These metrics we can get day in and day out, and they're very common. But
Hmm.
the differentiating thing, as you said, is not everybody adapts to the same exposure at the same rate. You know, you have certain genetic ceilings for certain people, which is totally fine. We understand that. But then you throw in this X factor of what is going on underneath the hood, and can that person's body sustain that output or workload based on what it is that they're doing? Or is there something telling us, like, hey, it's not just overreaching, which a lot of athletes overreach. We know this,
Yep.
but it's heading into overtraining, or you know, a lot of the habits that they are currently following through are not helping their body, you know, build itself back up to take advantage of general adaptation syndrome. So instead of continuing to bump up their baseline to handle the stress and workload of a season, of multiple seasons over the course of a college career, professional career, that window keeps getting shortened because the body is just continually getting battered down. And to me, that was a big, big eye opener once we started looking at the data, you know, of the Giants players, because they had a very strong relationship with Quest Diagnostics. And back then they had the Blueprint for Athlete program, which was available and accessible to teams, you know, in the NFL, the NBA, whoever wanted to be a part of it. And they were working on bringing it D2C. It didn't end up working out well, you know. I think it was a little bit before its time. I think it'd work out really well now, but unfortunately that project got scrapped. You know, I'm in the locker room with all these different types of dudes, you know, high level Hall of Fame caliber Eli Manning, and then you have freaking natures like Odell Beckham, Jason Pierre-Paul, like these dudes. You look at them and like, what they do on the field is insane. Like, it is so impressive. You know, you respect.
Absolutely.
It's awesome. And not only are they able to handle it from an NFL caliber workload, like they are standouts. And you're like, oh, you know, they're fit and they look good. You know what they can do in the weight room, the physiques, all that. It's like, so you assume they're healthy, and I think there's a big misconception from the outside, if you don't end up working with athletes and you know, immerse yourself in this data, that professional level athletes are healthy. They do any and everything to take care of their body, and the reality is that's not even close to being true. They're outliers of the outliers because they are special. You know, they are really good at a certain thing, and it's allowed them to propel themselves further in that category beyond not only the general population, but you know, a lot of the people that play the same type of sport or activity. But it doesn't mean that they've had high level, you know, high quality habits from the get go. It's, you know, I was able to progress in spite of this. And that's a very similar case for a lot of these athletes, a lot of these players. So, you know, we get body comp data, we have all the, you know, external metric tracking data, GPS, X, Y, and Z, and you assume that they're healthy.
Hmm.
Then you start looking deeper. And if you understand different aspects that can influence health, you look at, okay, you have these subjective measures, what they're telling us. You have certain objective external metrics, but we would get blood work back, and essentially it kind of just fell into my lap of putting together the panel and interpreting it. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, initially it first started with these standard reference ranges of what would come through. It's Quest and LabCorp are the two biggest conglomerates here in the States. And then all these subsidiary companies like your Function Health, Mito Health, they'll partner with them. Quest is the biggest. I think 3/4 of everything that gets done in the States is through Quest. So, I mean, great company, obviously. And they have the reference ranges. So it's comparing, and it doesn't say like, oh, hey, New York Giants athletes, elite athletes, we're going to segment you differently than comparing yourself to everybody else that gets tested, which make up these reference ranges. And we already know, you know, 88 to 93% of the American population, just based on recent data going back 6 years, is metabolically unhealthy, cardiometabolically unhealthy. We know people don't meet the average recommendations for 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity. They're not resistance training 2 to 3 times per day. They're not getting enough steps. They're not hydrating. I mean, everything. So we have reference ranges that are built upon a very unhealthy population. And then you throw in these high performers and you kind of lump them into the same category. But I'm like, you can't do that because one, the numbers are high or low based on the reference ranges. So to me, that's a red flag. What I would assume that these athletes are healthy, these 245-pound athletes, they've got, 10% body fat on calipers. So, it's legit. And they have inflammatory markers through the roof. Thyroid function based on 2 to 3 markers is not exactly where you'd want it to be. A1C is creeping up, and it's not just inflated because of aerobic training. It's because some of their insulin levels are a lot higher than you would expect them to be, even though they're so lean. So to me, it was like it partially is due to the fact that they play a very aggressive sport, like the most brutal contact sport on the planet. So there's gonna be things that happen underneath the hood that are gonna cause the body to have to endure a significant amount of stress. But on the flip side, if I'm getting data on somebody in the off season and I expect them to come in, fresh as a daisy, hopefully feeling really, really good, but the numbers aren't there, I'm thinking these guys aren't healthy, you
Mm.
know, and maybe this is one of the reasons why you see such high increases in injury rate is because you're compounding physical stressor, mental stressor, physical stressor, environmental stressor, spiritual stressor on top of the shoulders of a person because they are normal humans, and then they do these superhuman physical feats on a day in and day out basis to make money.
Mm.
And if their habits aren't good, if they're engaging in high risk behaviors, drug use, whatever, that's the reality of it, staying up very late, flying all over the country, not eating very well or consistently at all, having predispositions that aren't addressed, nutrient deficiencies, eating very poorly. Like the body's going to continue to wear itself down, even if they have superhuman strength or can do incredible things. So I think that's a big eye opener to say, like, okay, everything we've been preaching to these guys about sleep and rest and hydration and supplementation and eating well, it holds true. They've heard this stuff year in and year out, but they don't follow through with it. But now I actually have hard, objectionable data that I can take back to them and say, hey, this is you. I'm looking specifically at you. I know your background. I know your, injury history. I know your training load. I know X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to make this recommendation for you, whether it's a controllable lifestyle habit, whether it's I need you to focus on these types of foods because I see something in the blood work, or we need to add in this type of supplementation, not only from a performance, creatine and caffeine and all that, but hey, I'm looking underneath the hood and you have something that's kind of holding you back from a health perspective. And this is what we can do.
So let's really unpack this and contextualize some of the things that you just discussed there. When looking at an athlete's blood work, right? What would you say are some of the biggest mistakes people make when they're trying to interpret those labs? Because we know that there's not a one size fits all. So if I was to say, hey, Pratik, what labs would you order for just your general athlete who comes in very foundational? You're going to come back and say, well, Brandon, it depends, is because I have to ask more questions. And so for someone who is trying to get into some of this blood biomarkers to interpret health and performance, what mistakes are you seeing out there that people are making when it comes to interpreting these labs?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you have to stop the noise from the outside and trying to make everything perfect and look at 190 different things. Like, this isn't the Brian Johnson show where like the enhanced games happened this past weekend, and this guy was out there as a spokesperson. I
Yeah.
think Vegas, and because he's afraid of the sun or whatever, and he had an umbrella. I'm like, dude, the sun is good for you. What are you doing? I think it's kind of like three things. One is you look at a single marker in isolation, like in a vacuum. So if like CRP is elevated, or ferritin is too high or too low, or whatever it may be, like a lipid number isn't exactly where it needs to be, or it's using the reference ranges, but you look at it in isolation without any context. Sometimes if you go through a hard training block, you're going to expect inflammatory markers are going to potentially be elevated. You might see an elevation in CRP. You might see, if somebody's sick, you might see an elevation in white blood cell count, NNL ratio, and that's okay. Like, look, we're adults, we're parents, we train hard. That's just the body being exposed to a stressor, and it's calling to say we have to build it back up to take advantage of it, to get stronger once the stressor comes back. It's general adaptation syndrome 101. Or you see something like their creatinine levels are high. This is a very, very common one you see in athletes. And doctors get scared because they'll take creatinine and they want to measure glomerular filtration rate, GFR, to measure kidney health. And sometimes if you're training really intensely, there's going to be, creatinine's a byproduct of muscle breakdown too. Or if you supplement with creatine, even if it's high quality, you're going to have creatinine as a byproduct. And it's not because the body is not working the way it needs to. It's look, high protein diet, high training, supplementing with creatine, it's going to elevate it. And then if you calculate GFR based on that, you might get a low number. And then a doctor might see that and says, oh, your GFR is like 62. You have kidney disease, or you have an acute kidney injury. It's like, well,
Yeah.
no, why don't you just measure cystatin C, which would end up bypassing that instead, which is always going to be a better marker. And they're like, this is published in the literature. They say that this is a better marker to look at. So to me, that's one of the biggest things. The second is putting athletes in the same category as everybody else in the population with those standard reference ranges. Standard reference ranges might have you look at a marker, like say like insulin. Standard reference ranges just say, oh, if you go up to like 11, 15, even 20, it won't flag. I'm like, 20 insulin is super high. Like, that is not healthy at all.
Yeah.
Or even ferritin. You look at ferritin, it's like down to 25 and upwards of like 300. I'm like, down to 25 could potentially be anemic. Upwards of 300 may signal, a significant amount of inflammation. And to me, that's not fair when people look at these and they freak out. They're like, oh, my total cholesterol was 203, and my doctor is freaking out saying that, with no family history or anything else like that, with no other interpretation, the doctor's like, you continue on this path, you're going to have to get on medication. When it's like, is that even anything that's dangerous at all? Which more than likely, if you only take it in isolation, it's not a good thing. So you combine isolation with standard reference ranges, then that becomes an issue. And the third is just not understanding context entirely, especially from like an athlete perspective. And we know what athletes do is, you have your off season where you definitely want to train hard and push to get changes in adaptation, size, strength. And then you trickle into competitive phases where you on ramp and increase your volume and workload of practice time and sessions. And then you throw in competition, which ends up becoming a very stressful phase. You go through that with the potential of a postseason. And you go back to the off season again. So, everything isn't going to look the same throughout the entire year. And without understanding, like, hey, someone's going through a really intense 8 to 12 week training block, and then they're going to go into kind of like a maintenance period or like a taper down period. The body is experiencing a variety of different stressors, especially from a training perspective. And if you measure at different times, you're going to get different results based on that. So if you don't take into context of how somebody is sleeping, are they supplementing with certain things, what is training looking like, are they hydrating appropriately, how is their mind, their nervous system reset, you might see elevations at certain times. And then if you end up taking those one-off isolated numbers, you might see something elevated, not understand, like, hey, I've been training really, really hard and I'm beat up, but I'm getting into, a deload phase, which I'm looking forward to. Or an athlete's like, thank God, we have 2 weeks before we report for training camp. And that's exactly what it's supposed to do. So I think those are definitely some of the biggest mistakes I've seen.
It's so interesting you say that with the different reference ranges, is because sometimes we forget, and I'm sure you hear this all the time, is that you have normal reference ranges, then you have optimal reference ranges, and you have suboptimal. I think that we should always be striving for optimal, and it's our way of being proactive. right? Instead of waiting until like one of the things that I like to look at when I used to review a lot of blood-based biomarkers, I like to look at trends, right? So even though something could be lower on the normal side, and if I'm retesting it and I see it keep trending down, even though it's not out of that normal box, I'm going to consider that as being suboptimal, and I'm going to investigate a little bit further. Then I love the contextualizing piece of it, right? And so we're not just looking at an individual number. To your point, we're looking at training load. We're looking at time period during the season. We're looking at health wearables. And then we're looking at the blood based biomarkers and then nutrition. There's all these other things to take into account. And it speaks to how important it is to contextualize some of these blood based biomarkers, is because literally, if you look at these things in isolation, it can really send you down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree with that.
And the other thing, Teak, is like, where do you find that balance between like not over testing, not under testing, but testing the right amount of biomarkers? Is because we see this a lot in the functional medicine space where you're over testing with some of these labs, and it's kind of that analogy where if you go looking for something, you're definitely going to find it. And so in your experience, where have you kind of found that balance between not trying to over test or under test any of the clientele that you're dealing with?
Yeah, to me, it's I go in, if I'm working with somebody fresh out the gate, I go in with a mindset of I don't know anything about them. I want to see what this baseline looks like, if it's the right time of year to test, if it's an athlete in the off season, if it's an executive who's like, hey, I've got a month before an IPO or a takeover or a transition or an exit. I'm like, okay, let's try to do it when there's not a lot going on, because if you get baseline and there's a lot going on, it's going to muddy what the information is. But realistically, like, look, we can't wait for that kind of timeline to open up for everybody because everybody's just going through something differently. But testing the appropriate amount to start with is good. And it's not, this has to be done in a monthly cadence at all. Red blood cells turn over every 3 months. So you look at it as a minimum of 12 weeks. But what you can do is you test and hopefully you get a good baseline. And if there's something that flags or you see with context, like, okay, I have a better picture of what's going on, but I want to put a process together, controllable lifestyle factors, high priority nutrition, targeted supplementation, and see what happens. Are we actually making progress? And maybe 8 weeks later or so, like, I'm going to tease out some of these individual markers. So I think that's the beauty of what we can do with companies nowadays. You can go directly to Quest, you can go to LabCorp, you can go to Ulta Labs, whoever. Obviously, you want to use the same company and the same resource and the same testing center for keeping your testing standards the same. You don't want to jump around and say, oh, Superpower's got a sale here, and now, Function Health now has a super sale here. And it's like, no, we want to keep it as consistent as possible. And I want to test like 4 markers instead of the full, 100 to 120, 140. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because that just shows the interventions we're putting through, are they pushing us in the right direction? I'll give you an example. So in January, I did a Mito Health full on panel, and there were certain things that flagged, which, I knew they probably would because of my background. It's familial hypocholesterolemia. It's very common in the South Asian population. Not anything I'm overly worried about, but I'm like, I just want to make sure that I get a handle on it and I have an idea of a protocol I want to apply. So got tested in January. I'm like, okay, I'm going to apply this from a controllable lifestyle standpoint. I'm going to eat more of this food, cut down on this, and these are the supplements I'm going to take. Tested again just a couple weeks ago. Same company. I bought just 3 or 4 markers instead of doing the whole panel. And what it showed me is the steps that I took moved me in the right direction. So that was a positive thing to say, okay, this is great. So ideally, the cadence you'd want, I think, for a lot of people would be a minimum of 1 time per year. I think it's not cheap. I wish it was covered by insurance, and I wish it, even if you had to pay out of pocket, it wasn't like you had to spend, $300 to $500 every time. But that's just the reality if you want a very, very good concentrated panel. But that information that you do get is very much worth it. Now, you don't have to get these expensive panels every time you go get tested. You can find out what you're looking to improve, and you can just plop out 2 or 3 things, spend $30 or $40 and get it tested again to show, like, am I being pushed in the right direction? Same thing for athletes. At the beginning of an off season, maybe before they head back with their team. So I'll use the NFL as an example because obviously we had the opportunity to do that, and I kind of do it now with my clients in the off season. So the second the season is over, give them a week or so to just calm down, like be with your family, don't think about anything or do anything, and then let's just look at how healthy you are in the terms of how much damage did the season do to you. We'll get baseline data, then put together a protocol for them to implement for about 3 to 4 months, depending on when their team reconvenes. Now, off-season training for the NFL starts in mid-April. So the goal would be, I want to see where you're at before you leave for the team. That way I can give you recommendations to continue doing this, or, hey, take this away. Don't worry, we corrected that action. Tell your team about this. So there's open communication there. They go through the off-season training program and then potentially get them tested again before training camp. That way we have a better idea of, okay, this is your health status heading into the season, and then, let them go. When I was with the Giants, we'd have one draw during the off-season training program. So I moved it from the end of off-season training to trying to get them done in the beginning, because, we would get labs done at the end of May, and then they would be gone a week later. And I'm like, you haven't gotten your booklets back. You haven't even gotten the data. I'm trying to, contact these guys, and these guys don't want to hear anything for the next 2 to 3 weeks because they're just trying to focus on themselves before training camp starts. And I'm like, this is pointless. I need more time with you guys to, one, be there in person to explain what's going on. And it allows us more time to apply an intervention before training camp starts. So we would do quarterly draws during the season at different time points. Not everybody had to follow through. I would like to get at least 1 or 2 draws from the players just to see if some of the progress that we had made is continuing to hold, but also how are their bodies changing during a season, with not only what the team looks like cumulatively, but individual players based on their workload, based on their habits, because you have players all over the place. And it's very interesting seeing, when you don't win, what does that do with the motivation and psychology of a player, but also how does that impact your body? Because it impacts you mentally. And what is that corresponding physiological difference? If you're winning, dopamine's hitting hard and testosterone levels are high. Yep. Even if you're not playing, like, everybody loves it. It's fun. But when you're not winning, that definitely has a significant impact that people don't necessarily think about. And it influences you, not only your habits from a psychological perspective and a hormonal perspective. And some of this stuff has been studied when winning versus losing on testosterone and dopamine and cortisol. And I'm like, okay, if you're not winning and you're losing, is that negatively going to impact you physiologically? And how is that going to show up with injury rates and your ability to perform on the field, just specifically from a standpoint? So these are all the things that, like, would start popping in my head as we would get data on the players. And, I'm like, well, we got to come up with interventions for them on the spot, because no one's looking at it or addressing it, but it's negatively holding them back.
Would you also say, like, when a player is injured, do you ever find it's worth also running a few labs to see how that player or athlete is recovering? If so, like, what are some examples of labs that you would consider?
Yeah, I think that's very common because, with any sports medicine system, when an athlete gets injured, and it's a significant injury, and I'm not talking about, it's a minor strain and this player is going to be out for like 2 to 3 practice days, but going to get ready to play on game day. I'm thinking something more significant and long-term, whether it's a tendon or ligament injury, whether it's a break, even something along the lines of a concussion, because, that's a big deal in contact sports too. What's common in the hospital health systems is they'll take labs. So, when I spoke at the conference, and I said, one of the first things that they do when you go to the hospital, regardless of who you are, whether you're an athlete or whether you're, mom and pop, is they want to ask questions and figure out what's wrong. Because if you look internally and something's flagging or signaling, they can give you higher quality care instead of, throwing darts at a dartboard and trying to figure out, well, you said something hurts, but, this is what protocol ends up looking like. Well, no, let's be smart about it. But they won't look at a full comprehensive panel. It's just kind of like your standard CMP,
CBC.
Yeah, CBC. which is good and all, but at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's dive deeper into hormones, micronutrients, overall inflammatory markers, looking deeper on thyroid, glucose control, and insulin. So to me, if people aren't actually testing and getting that off-season data, looking at a wide variety of markers and figuring out where somebody's baseline is, and you only do it after an injury, well, how do you compare that data? One of the most important things you can do for an athlete or even for yourself is get longitudinal data on yourself, because once you start seeing drift, is the drift expected based on the context of what you're going through, or is it significantly outside of what we were expecting? And that's showing up as a contributing factor for overreaching or overtraining or something potentially disastrous happening because the body is not in the right frame to be adaptable and handle the additional stress. So yeah, I think it's great to get data on somebody when they are injured, but if you don't have the opportunity to compare it, can you find a correlation and a connection to say maybe the reason why this happened is we're seeing something internally and there was an overload here or something that wasn't addressed, so the body just wasn't able to handle that additional stress.
Another thing too, question that kind of came to mind is that even though someone can be physically ready after an injury, right? We understand the importance of all the rehab things that have to be done. But is it worth even still taking it a step further to look at labs on a more cellular level to see if they are ready as well, to kind of compare up against them being physically ready, or would you say more so someone being physically ready is enough data for you to go based on to say, all right, now it's time for that athlete or player to get back into practice mode or game day mode? What are kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, to me, I think that's a great question. And it's not about just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. The question you pose to me ends up becoming valuable because in return to play, we already know that there are a handful of these external metrics that we look at, whether you're measuring unilateral power, you're measuring, speed, you're measuring certain levels of strength. Um, to me, those will end up getting there, but there might be something, cognitively or something below the hood that's holding them back. So if you have that external strength type data and you have it before the injury and you try to get somebody back to that injury, well, to me, the comment should be made is you got them back to the strength level that they were at that predisposed them to having an injury before. So getting them back there, is that good enough to make sure that they are good? But as we already know, working in sport for a very long time, and this, the biggest injury risk is a previous history of an injury. So the more injuries you have, like we already know that risk goes up for something happening in the future. So is there a missing piece? Do we need to look at, more resting heart rate HRV data, combining with the strength data, combining with what's going on underneath the hood? Is there resiliency also being built in through blood work and the organ systems and the tissues that we can't see from a strength perspective? Because remember, I mentioned before, a lot of these athletes are strong, but internally there's a lot of stress, erosion, a lot of things going on that you don't know about because your status quo is the status quo. You continue doing what it is that you're doing without knowing, like, oh, my vitamin D numbers are super low, or my CRP levels are super high, my insulin levels are high, my estimated average glucose levels are a lot higher than I would assume them to be, and thyroid signaling isn't great, and there's a lot of dysfunction going on underneath the hood that you don't feel about. So again, in a perfect world, I think that would be awesome to apply, but in reality, it does become more difficult because you would have to have a protocol in place. You have to spend the money on the draw. Someone's got to have to interpret it within a very short context. And, sometimes it takes 2 to 3 up to 7 days to get information back when, you can't wait because
Yeah.
coach is like, I need this person back. And then the player's like, I need to get back in. I can't be
Yeah.
sitting, getting rehab all the time. So I think the question is great. The data is there and it can be applied to a situation like that. It's just, can you handle it?
Yeah, the practical piece is always important to look at because exactly to your point, where that extra 3, 5 days to make someone sit out is very meaningful, like to a player. They're already anxious, waiting to come back while they're going through their rehab. Now you're saying, all right, to make sure I'm 100% ready, just for reassurance, I got to wait an extra 3 to 5 days until my labs come back. So I could see the practical piece kind of interfering with that a little bit. Now, another thing I kind of want to hit on, man, is like how do we put this into practicality? So for our audience, I'd love to run through like some case-based scenarios so they can understand better like what's the thought process behind contextualizing some of these blood-based biomarkers. So let's just say I'm a high level endurance athlete complaining of fatigue, poor recovery, and declining performance despite training harder. What labs, give or take, are you looking at?
Yeah, I think, for an endurance athlete, you want to get like a full iron workup just to see, is the body able to deliver oxygen to the tissues appropriately? Is your ferritin levels appropriately? So, you can run ferritin with CBC, and that can give you a whole list of things. And luckily, that's a panel that doesn't cost very much. What looks right from hemoglobin and hematocrit perspective. And what does vitamin D look like? Your thyroid panel too, because sometimes if you are engaging in a high amount of energy expenditure and you're not eating appropriately, the body's signaling, like it realizes that, energy availability is low, TSH bumps up, T3, T4 goes down, and the body's like, dude, you're not giving me exactly what it is that I need, but I'm going to continue to push hard because it hasn't gotten to that point where overreaching turns into overtraining. And I think understanding that and being able to catch it before it happens can be very valuable. This is something that's very common in endurance athletes, because to be an endurance athlete, you are training high volumes day in and day out. You're specifically focusing more on the aerobic component of it. And you're not blasting, 3, 4, 5 days of resistance training too. You
Yeah.
might complement it with 1 to 2 days of, full body, not going overboard. But that becomes really, really important. But also hormones too. Are your cortisol levels kind of staying in check, or are you engaging in such high volume, high intensity, oxidative stress is through the roof, and cortisol stays really, really elevated, which is going to impact the body's ability to choose and utilize substrate when you do get into your workloads and sessions. Lactate starts accumulating a lot faster. You're unable to clear it as much because the body's just in this constantly stressed state. And that's one of these things that we end up seeing long term when people talk about these endurance athletes, these ultra endurance athletes, and heart issues and cardiovascular complications. It's not because exercise and high volume of exercise is bad, is because the body is engaged in the high amount of stress that it can't handle in the moment, and there are things underneath the surface that aren't being done to mitigate that. So I think understanding that is really, really important. And the pointing the finger, just saying, oh, doing marathons is bad for you. Well, yeah, if you don't take care of yourself, doing anything is bad for you. Lifting too much and, just
Absolutely.
gaining weight just for the sake of pushing more weight because you have more mass and force, that's not good for you.
Yeah. Let's build on that high level endurance athlete for a second because, one of the things that I see is often overlooked. I don't know if you see this too, is that we'll have practitioners look at only the CBC when we're thinking about anemia versus iron deficiency because a lot of times there's this misconception where we're only looking at if an athlete is anemic, but we're forgetting that these are two separate terms, anemia and then also iron deficiency. So there's actually more cases, and you probably know this too, there's more cases of iron deficiency without anemia than anemia with iron deficiency. So with that being said, do you think that there is a role or a play, especially with your female endurance runners or athletes, the importance of really checking that iron panel, looking at that ferritin to see if this can be, hey, iron deficiency without anemia? I would even say like this should be baseline standard labs for any of your female endurance athletes that an iron panel should always be ran as part of their baseline markers and not just looking at CBC where we're only trying to detect if a female athlete is anemic or not.
Yeah, to me, that's really important because females have higher iron needs than men. And sometimes,
Yep.
it might be easier for an average man to get the appropriate amount of the 8 milligrams of iron versus females need 18. And especially I mentioned endurance athletes, definitely you start seeing that a lot more because having the appropriate iron homeostasis in the body is very, very important for endurance performance because you want to make sure that there's appropriate amount of not only red blood cells, but oxygen carrying capability there. So I think getting that full panel is really, really important. And obviously dividing it and not just saying like, hey, I'm just going to get a one-off ferritin, but not look at everything else. You want total iron, you want iron binding capacity, transfer and saturation percentage, and ferritin to see. When all those markers are looked at, you can actually give, and again, I don't diagnose, but you can give a recommendation to say, I think you have iron deficiency, but there's no anemia,
Yep.
or you have um, anemia and iron deficiency combined. Because iron deficiency in and of itself is a very, very common problem that affects
A lot of
millions of
people.
people on the planet. Like, people don't realize
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
very, very common thing. But the combination of iron deficiency and anemia, because anemia can show up in itself with being like pernicious anemia, megaloblastic anemia. Is it B12 influenced? You also want to look at um, A1C too, because sometimes you see these elevated A1Cs and people are like, well, do you have glucose control problems? Well, no, it's hemoglobin A1C. So if you have really, really high endurance capacity or potential, you're going through a specific training block. I see this a lot of times in some of the track athletes that I work with. Some of these A1Cs are a little bit inflated, but it's not the end of the world. So I'm like, okay, you can look at fasting glucose, insulin, and maybe even like fructosamine to show that this isn't a glucose problem. This is just, a high volume endurance training block that you're going through. So to me, yeah, I think that is such a huge, huge thing that female endurance athletes can and should get. So not looking just as at a CBC, but let's look at everything iron related too, because then you get more insight when you have 4 or 5 of these measures to explain, is it inflated or deflated just because of training? Is it inflammation? Or specifically, like, is this full blown, you have iron deficiency or iron deficiency anemia?
And for female athletes or anybody in general who is typically iron deficient, I know a lot of times the question comes up, what type of iron supplement should I essentially be taking, right? Considering that you're doing all the things to meet your nutritional needs, but in the event you are doing that and you're still iron deficient, with all the different iron salt forms out there, like we know that ferrous sulfate has the highest bioavailability. But the drawback of that is that it can cause you to be constipated or have an upset stomach. So, in the event that that is not someone's first option, is there any other iron supplements that you would recommend that can meet close to that bioavailability to maximize absorption if someone is iron deficient?
Yeah, you mentioned ferrous sulfate is very common. That's generally what's used in practice. And, you basically kind of take it at the end of the day, independent of, calcium and a variety of other things that are going to inhibit absorption. But
Yep.
truthfully, well, working with a lot of female athletes, and most recently I was consulting with the pro female soccer team. We would see some ferritin levels that were low, and these athletes would say, like, "Look, I've been told to take iron since I was in college, and I take it consistently, and it doesn't do anything for me. It makes me feel kind of sick and ill." To me, one of the biggest things that sometimes doesn't get discussed is iron overload, specifically from supplements, because just because you take an iron supplement doesn't mean it gets digested and delivered to the target tissues appropriately where we would want it to be stored, if we want the cells to utilize it. And iron overload is an issue, long term in terms of health. Potential could lead to ferroptosis, which is the breakdown of different cells and tissues, which can be very pro-inflammatory. In my mind, it's also looking at what potentially internally can cause a misuse or is affecting absorption of iron, especially if some of these athletes are, like, hey, I eat meat, I eat red meat, I have plenty of vitamin C, but is this just my body doesn't utilize it appropriately? Because if hepcidin keeps staying elevated because you are pro-inflamed, it's going to inhibit the absorption of iron. And that's why, truth be told, if you do end up taking an iron supplement, you'd want to space it out every other day, because once you take it, hepcidin is going to increase. And if you take it day after day, it's going to stay elevated and prevent the absorption of it. And then you have all this iron that's unbound getting to in the blood and target tissues that aren't getting it where it needs to be. One of my favorite things of recent note is lactoferrin. Lactoferrin helps with
Mm.
keeping hepcidin down, allows iron to get deposited exactly where it needs to go. And there are clinical trials that have been published, even of recent note, especially from some of these companies are now making lactoferrin, which is structurally very similar to human lactoferrin, which is made, through the colostrum of mother's milk, which we get as infants, but it's been studied throughout the lifespan. Before the human equivalent, you have the bovine versions, you have, goat versions, and they've shown promise, but not every, it's not an equivalent with, you take that amount and that amount gets absorbed. Anything you take is going to get broken down and only a small percentage of it gets absorbed. So to me, that's one of my favorite things to actually start an athlete or person on instead of just throwing iron at them. Because for a lot of these people, they've tried iron before, and one, the numbers
Hmm.
have gone up. Two, internally, it has caused some GI issues, and it's not actually fixing or resolving the problem.
I like the point that you actually brought up about. I think that a lot of times people don't understand also how to take iron to maximize its absorption. So, to your point, what you just said, taking it every other day, making sure that we're taking it separate from any type of calcium or any type of antacids, which can affect its absorption, the timing of when you can take iron, all those small details matter when it comes to the absorption of it. Yeah. So, what's been in the headlines for a while, Pratik, and I'm sure you've probably been inundated with questions around it with the Darren Peterson story. I mean, my God, with the creatine supplementation concerns surrounding lab values, we know situations like this can create fear around supplements and kidney functions, and we hear this a lot with creatine being the enemy that's leading to your increase, serum creatinine levels. So, but from your perspective, how should clinicians properly evaluate a scenario like this and not
Yeah,
essentially looking at one lab in isolation to tell us the whole story?
yeah. And I think it's important, it's easy for a lot of people, and clinicians do this a lot, coaches do this a lot. We sit on the sidelines and we don't know the full context of everything that happens underneath the story. We just go by, these are the narratives the media has put out. This is this side of the story from the athlete. This is this side of the story from, the school or the team. So essentially what happened is Darren Peterson is probably going to be the number one pick in the NBA draft. Does it already happen? I can't
He's
remember.
projected. Yeah.
Projected number one pick out of KU. So very talented kid. Unfortunately, he had throughout the season he had some issues, cramping issues, maybe soft tissue injury issues that had him
Hmm.
sidelined for a good chunk of the year. And college teams only play about 30 games, in the regular season heading into tournament time, and then the round of 64. So if you miss 7, 8, 9 games, that's a significant chunk of time away from your team. So initially it came out after the fact because they didn't want to talk about it because of HIPAA, which obviously you want to protect the athletes, the client, the patient,
Yep.
that it was serious cramping problems. And then after the fact, it was said that the cramping problems were caused by creatine. He said something to the extent of, "Well, I took a bunch of creatine. We don't know the amount that was taken because that information wasn't shared. We don't know how he took it, how much water or fluid he took. Was there a ramp up protocol, what his training load was at that time, the internal status of what was going on." And he said that the cramps are so bad and the muscle spasms and the pain was so bad, he was in the training room, said like he felt like he was going to die. And again, that could have been the case. Look, if this kid's going through it, you never want him to go through that. You don't want an athlete, you don't want a client, you don't want a family member, anybody to experience anything like that. But also looking at the fact that an issue like that has not happened within that program. K is a very, very successful program. I know their strength coach is very, very good. Nothing like that has ever happened. This guy isn't playing a significant amount of more minutes than anybody else in that program. They've had, number one draft picks in the past under Bill Self. So to
Yep.
me, it's like, okay, there's a disconnect between somewhere, what he's saying he's doing, saying like, oh, I'm doing everything right from a sleep, recovery, nutrition perspective. And then to me, I'm like, knowing I've worked with a lot of these dudes, from my time in college, but also outside of the fact. So I know what their habits are really like. Uh,
Hmm.
just from my experience, I know that there's a lot left on the table, especially if you're talking about players in basketball that are highly recruited, that have a high amount of potential. So it's like, okay, maybe there's misinformation there, but also at the same point, did they have any data on the back end to look at what's going on underneath the hood? If he has significant cramping issues, is he sickle cell? Have they been very proactive about providing the appropriate recommendations for him? Because I've worked with tons of sickle cell athletes, and I know like we keep an eye on them. Everybody on the field and the training staff and the strength conditioning staff knows exactly who they are. We have precautions on them. You try to monitor their workloads in practice and you try not to baby in them for game day. But the truth is, like, overexertion can be really significant for these types of athletes. And it's not their fault. That's just how they are. That's a predisposition. Is there any blood work done? Obviously, what did that serum creatinine look like? And what was the baseline versus where he was at? Also looking even at CK levels. If he was
Yeah.
going through a significant amount of training, if his training was high volume, if he was not taking care of himself from a nutritional supplementation perspective, recovery, what did his resting heart rate HRV look like? Then obviously going through intense amount of practices when he's physically not ready and able to get there. And then maybe this is something he's experienced and he's never been able to get to a very good high level baseline, and he's always been thrown into the fire, and his training load is really, really high. To me, that would have been really interesting information to look at to say what's actually going on underneath the hood before pointing fingers, and what can and should be done before this happens, during, and then afterwards to make sure. But to me, again, I'll always talk about creatine. We don't know what the dosage was. We don't know the brand. We don't know how much he was taking. Did he hydrate appropriately? Was he consuming enough carbohydrate? Because, elite college basketball players, you need to consume a significant amount. They
Yeah.
they they eat way less than they need. I mean, we already know this. Energy availability probably wasn't as good as it needed to be. But I think from a creatine perspective, even with football is much, much more of a physiological demand than basketball is from an overall perspective, especially when you're outside in the heat and the humidity and you have pads on and you're getting blasted. So I've never seen anything like that in my time with football. Players taking creatine upwards of 10 to 20 to 30 grams a day.
Jeez.
So yeah, yeah. So to me, and it's split doses. Obviously, taking it all at
Right.
once goes straight through you. Your body's not going to be able to handle that. We gotta push
Yeah.
it out. It's going to draw water into the gut. It's not a fun
Yeah.
thing. But to me, again, looking at what does that data show, not just looking at creatinine and GFR, CK is good, cystatin C, what is going on with kidney health and function overall, all around. That would be really good information to have before putting any commentary out there, pointing the fingers and making any judgments. What were his habits like? Was he really following through with everything that was recommended to him, or was he kind of wishy washy, which is very much the case with a lot of younger athletes, just from my perspective and my experience. So, what was his BUN levels? Was that would give us an idea of was he hydrating appropriately? Was he overdoing it on protein? Was he again so many questions to
Yeah.
ask. What was the serum sodium, chloride, potassium levels, calculating anion gap? That would have been really interesting too.
Have you ever found in the NCAA, from what I was told, when it comes to some of the blood biomarker testing, I heard that the only things that they really look at as part of their physical is G6PD and then sickle cell anemia.
Yeah, it's tough. That's one of the biggest things that I think could be so valuable, but is not easy to
Correct.
accomplish because if you're talking about a basketball team, MLB, baseball team, NFL football team, you're only talking about one sport. This many athletes, a lot of money available to
Yeah.
invest looking at that. If you're talking about an athletic department, you can have 400 to 720 to 1,000 athletes, and a really good blood draw, a comprehensive blood draw that isn't overinflated in price. I mean, we'll say looking at anywhere from $300 to $550. And to add more of those, some of these one-off markers can be 30 to 50 to $75, and it takes a week to 2 weeks to get that information back. Um, that's always going to be the barrier of entry for that to be assimilated into college programs because insurance isn't going to pay for it. So you can only put what insurance might potentially take care of, and then everything else has to be out of pocket. Do you limit it to the money making sports? And in college, it's only football and basketball, men's basketball. Everybody else, unfortunately, every other men's sport, every other female sport loses money. So is it in their best interest to invest in it? I think it is, because if you can use that information, maybe you spend $500 an athlete, but you cut down on $1,000 worth of insurance billing and injury costs, then that
Hmm.
ROI has already helped itself out quite a bit. Especially when you're talking about NIL and how much these schools are paying these kids. If you get your $1 million quarterback to play one more game, or basketball player to not, miss out on 3 games because you were more proactive about learning about that individual, and it only costs you $300 or $500. I'm like, yeah, that trade off is well worth it.
Yeah, I think college sports, I mean, they could do a better job with utilizing some of the blood biomarker testing because my God, man, just G6PD and sickle cell anemia, that's not going to tell you much. But I also wonder too, like, yeah, it's probably a budget thing, but also if it can be a liability thing where they may think that, or at least the athlete may think that the blood biomarkers can be used against them if they were to go into the NFL or NBA draft.
Yeah, and I think that's the teetering that line is never easy. A lot of players think doing urinalysis or doing like even a hydration test. Oh, what are you testing for? I'm like, no, this isn't a drug test, man. I'm just trying to see
Yeah,
for
exactly.
to tell you, hey, here's this volume of fluid, this electrolyte packet, kind of drink it now and then another one before practice. So I get it because they've never been exposed to it before, and maybe something adverse
Yep.
happened where somebody got some tests done and it was used negatively against them. Obviously, the negative aspects of certain things get talked about a lot more than the positive, and because that may be only what they've seen or been exposed to, you can't fault them for that because I think the educational piece is always going to be really, really important. Um, but I think there's so much good information out there that can add so much value to what athletic departments can do for their athletes. And, they don't have to do a full on panel, but, maybe omega-3% index and 6-to-3 ratio and vitamin D, uh, maybe even just a CMP and CBC to start with, just to see what's going on. I mean, that stuff is 15, $20. That's not very
Yeah,
much.
it's dirt cheap. I think if they at least had a basic lab panel that they can pull from, at the very least, would be a good start. Just checking G6PD and sickle cell anemia.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to, do you have somebody that can interpret it appropriately?
True. Yeah. Because some colleges, believe it or not, you know this, they don't have sports dietitians.
Yeah.
Resources are limited at certain universities. And so then they have the athletic trainer doing the prehab, rehab, admin. Now they're also consulting on nutrition, blood biomarkers. Can quickly get a bit overwhelming. So listen, how does someone get trained or well versed in the athlete blood biomarkers? So as you mentioned earlier on our podcast discussion, like literally it took you almost 10 years to really master and understand how to contextualize some of these blood biomarkers because literally this is not in a textbook. Where would someone get this knowledge on blood-based biomarkers to at least get started somewhere?
Yeah, I think obviously there are two things you can do. One, they have some books out there that talk about all the different biomarkers that you can test. And they are good reads. It's definitely better than not having any knowledge behind it. But ultimately, immersing yourself in the data, working with people of a variety of different populations gives you that experience and exposure. And, I was kind of thrown in the fire in a positive way back with the Giants. It was almost 10 years ago. And I made a lot of mistakes starting out. And obviously, I would go back and redo a lot, but that's just how we evolve and go through anything. Um, but having spoken with a lot of people at the conference, and they were asking, what resources can I look at? Are there papers out there? Are there books? To me, it just started resounding with me is like, I would really love to teach people this, but also provide something that I needed 10 years ago, something that I continue to use and refine. So I think, born out of this collaboration with Sports Pharmacy, the group, and myself, I've created an advanced biomarkers course. And it's starting in July. What it's going to be, I'm going to officially offer it to the Sports Pharmacy group at a discounted rate, and it's going to be a self-paced course. There's 4 different videos. There's 140 slides. I talk about everything. Not only do I sequence it with the background and the history and context, give you protocols and frameworks that go through all the different systems from cardiovascular to glucose control to thyroid to hormones to iron to white blood cell, and explain it. Not only what the marker is, but contextualize it with ideal performance health ranges, how it connects to other systems, and what you can do from a 3-pillar framework of controllable lifestyle factors, high priority nutrition, and targeted supplementation to improve someone's situation. So there's a lot of real life case studies. We talk about female specific hormone biomarkers as well, because they don't follow the same guidelines as men do, and it's important to really understand that population as well. And I also offer 2 Q&A sessions where, after the first 2 weeks, you go through the modules, you fire off any questions. I'll answer all of them. I'll record a video, send it back. We'll do that 2 different times. So the goal is to provide as much value and education and awareness to take you from somebody that maybe knows a little bit or not a lot to just being a lot more comfortable and confident to where you go through it, you are light years ahead of where I was after year 2 or 3, with the Giants having been thrown into this for a few different years. Because realistically, you and I were talking, you're not going to find this in a paper, you're not going to find this in a book. Like, the goal is to have somebody that has learned it and made a lot of the mistakes, but also understood where that came from to be able to kind of take somebody through this.
And where could people at least sign up, like on your waiting list, since it's not coming out to July? We know the company's Blueprint, but what's a good website people
Yeah,
should people should
I
go
can
to?
drop the link before so you can see what it's about. You can reserve your spot because I wanted this to be very intimate, and obviously I'm only going to open this first go round, with the Sports Pharmacy Network at the reduced cost. So after this first go round, the price is going to go up. So I definitely would jump on it if you have any interest or do. But there's a save my spot form on the website, which, don't worry, you're not going to be charged anything. It just lets me know, once I hit the appropriate amount of people that I feel comfortable with, then I'm going to cap it. And obviously we'll run it again coming up here later on after. But wanted to give the opportunity to, this group first because it was such a fun experience getting a chance to talk at the conference and speaking with everybody. And there's a lot of excitement around.
And we're gonna run it back next year, man.
Yeah.
All right, so Teak, man, really appreciate you joining us on the Sports RX Network podcast, man. For our audience out there, you know where to find Pratik Patel. He is on Instagram, very active on LinkedIn. I believe you even have an X account. There's many places to follow him and get more information about some of the amazing work that he's doing with the blood-based biomarkers. That's all we have time for today, guys. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. We hope that you found the content of this episode insightful and thought provoking for both your health and performance. As a quick reminder, you can sign up for our newsletter or exclusive membership offering through our site, sportsrxnetwork.com. Follow and share our content on social media and subscribe to the podcast. We will include any relevant studies or references in the show notes. As a reminder, this information provided by the Sports Pharmacy Network is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Thank you again for listening to the Sports Pharmacy Network podcast, and we look forward to you joining us on the next episode.